The whispers started the moment Clara stepped into Morrison's trading post, her scarred hands clutching a worn leather satchel that held everything she owned in this unforgiving world of 1878 Wyoming Territory. She had arrived in Cheyenne 3 days prior on the Union Pacific Railroad, fleeing a past that clung to her like the dust on her threadbare dress. The trading post smelled of tobacco, leather, and judgment. Clara needed supplies for the journey west, hoping to find work as a seamstress or laundress in one of the mining camps, anywhere she could disappear and start fresh. But the moment old man Morrison saw the burns that twisted up her left arm and the side of her neck, visible despite her attempts to hide them beneath a shawl, his expression shifted from curiosity to something colder. "Fire got you, did it?" Morrison asked, his voice loud enough that the handful of customers turned to stare. Clara nodded, keeping her eyes down. "House fire, sir. 2 years back in Kansas." "Shame," Morrison said, though his tone suggested he felt none. "Real shame when a woman gets marked up like that. Makes her damaged goods, I suppose. Hard to find a husband when you look like you've been through hell itself." The words struck harder than any physical blow. Clara had heard variations of this assessment countless times since the fire that killed her parents and left her with scars that proclaimed her tragedy to anyone who looked. She reached for the tin of coffee on the shelf, her hands trembling slightly. "How much for the coffee and some flour?" She asked quietly. Before Morrison could answer, the door swung open with enough force to rattle the glass jars on the counter. A man stepped inside, tall and lean, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of a winter sky. He wore dusty chaps over worn denim, a leather vest over a dark shirt, and a hat that had seen better days. His boots made solid sounds against the wooden floor as he approached the counter. "Morrison," he said with a curt nod. "Need to pick up that order I sent word about, Mr. Dalton," Morrison replied, his demeanor shifting to something more respectful. "Got it in the back. Give me just a moment." As Morrison disappeared through a curtain into the storage area, Clara tried to make herself invisible, examining the limited selection of fabric on a nearby table. She could feel the cowboy's gaze on her, studying, assessing. She braced herself for more cruelty. "Those burns must have hurt something fierce," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. Clara's throat tightened. "They did." "My sister survived a barn fire when we were children," he continued, moving closer but maintaining a respectful distance. "Left her with scars across her back and shoulders. Didn't make her any less remarkable. She went on to become the best horse trainer in 3 counties before she married and moved to Oregon." Clara looked up at him then, searching his face for mockery and finding none. His expression was open, honest, with crinkles at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled often. "People here don't seem to share that perspective," Clara said softly. The cowboy glanced toward the back room where Morrison had disappeared. "People like Morrison measure worth by appearances because they lack the depth to see anything else. Name's James Dalton. I run a ranch about 15 miles north of here." "Clara Bennett," she replied, allowing herself a small smile. Morrison emerged with a large crate, setting it heavily on the counter. "That'll be $20, Dalton." James counted out the money, then glanced at the items Clara had selected. "Add the lady's purchases to my bill." "That's not necessary," Clara protested, color rising in her cheeks. "I know it's not necessary," James replied, his tone warm, "but I'm doing it anyway. Consider it a welcome to Wyoming." Morrison rang up the sale with visible disapproval, clearly unhappy about being denied the opportunity to overcharge Clara. As he wrapped her items in brown paper, James picked up his crate and turned to Clara. "You looking for work, Miss Bennett?" The question caught her off guard. "I am, actually. I was planning to head west to the mining camps, see if anyone needs sewing or washing done." James shook his head firmly. "Those camps are no place for a woman alone. Rough men, rougher conditions. You'd be lucky to make it a week without trouble finding you." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "My ranch needs a housekeeper." Previous one moved back east to care for her aging mother about 3 months ago. Place has gone to hell without someone to maintain it properly. I've got 4 ranch hands who bunk in the quarters behind the main house, and we all eat like bachelors, which is to say poorly and irregularly. Clara's heart began to race. You're offering me a position. I'm offering you honest work for honest pay, James said. $20 a month plus room and board. You'd have your own room in the main house, door that locks. My men are good sorts, but I run a strict outfit. Anyone who disrespects you answers to me, and I don't tolerate nonsense. She wanted to accept immediately, but caution held her tongue. You don't know anything about me. I could be a terrible housekeeper. Can you cook? Yes. Can you clean? Yes. Can you manage supplies and keep track of expenses? I managed my father's general store for 6 years before the fire. I'm good with numbers and inventory. James smiled then, a full genuine smile that transformed his weathered face. Then you're perfect for my home. What do you say, Miss Bennet? The words hit her with unexpected force. Perfect. When had anyone called her perfect? When had anyone looked past the scars to see what she could offer? Clara felt tears prick her eyes but refused to let them fall. When would you need me to start? How about today? I'm heading back now. You can ride in the wagon. Clara looked at the packages Morrison had prepared, at the cowboy who stood waiting with patient expectation, at the door that led to either another rejection or possibly a new beginning. The choice seemed almost too simple. Yes, she said. Yes, I'll come with you. Morrison snorted from behind the counter. You're making a mistake, Dalton. Hiring damaged goods never works out. James's expression hardened as he turned to face the storekeeper. The only mistake I see is judging a person's worth by their scars instead of their character. Miss Bennet survived something that would have killed a weaker person. That tells me she's got strength and resilience, which are the qualities I value most. He picked up his crate and Clara's packages. I don't expect we'll be doing much business here anymore, Morrison. I'll take my custom to Anderson's place in town from now on. They left the trading post together, stepping into the bright afternoon sunshine. James's wagon waited by the hitching post, pulled by 2 sturdy horses. He loaded the supplies into the back, then offered Clara his hand to help her up onto the seat. His grip was strong and calloused from hard work, but his touch was gentle. As they rolled out of town, Clara watched the buildings of Cheyenne fade behind them. The landscape opened up into rolling prairie, golden grass rippling in the wind like waves on an ocean. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still dusted with snow despite the summer heat. Tell me about your ranch, Clara said, needing to fill the comfortable silence. Dalton Ranch, James replied, keeping his eyes on the road. Been in my family for 12 years now. My father claimed the land and built the original cabin. When he passed 5 years ago, my mother couldn't bear to stay. Too many memories. She went to live with my sister in Oregon, left the place to me. I've built it up since then, expanded the herd to about 300 head of cattle, added the bunkhouse, expanded the main house. It's good land with a creek that runs year-round and plenty of grazing. And your ranch hands. 4 good men. Charlie's the oldest, been with us since my father's time. He's 60 if he's a day, best tracker in the territory. Then there's Miguel and his brother Carlos, came up from Texas 3 years ago. Hardest workers I've ever seen. And Tommy, he's the youngest, just turned 19. Eager as a puppy and still learning, but he's got heart. Clara relaxed slightly. The way James spoke about his men suggested he was a fair employer, someone who valued loyalty and hard work. What happened to the previous housekeeper? You said she moved back east. Mrs. Henderson, yes. Fine woman, been with us 2 years. Her daughter wrote saying her mother was ailing, needed care. Mrs. Henderson left in early spring. I told her she'd always have a place here if she wanted to come back, but I suspect she'll stay in Boston. City woman at heart she was. Always said Wyoming was too wild for her taste. And you've been managing without help since then, James grimaced. Barely. The house is a disaster. We've been eating mostly beans and bacon, whatever we can cook over an open fire without burning. The men are getting restless with the poor conditions. I tried to hire someone from town, but most women won't come out to a ranch full of men, and I can't blame them for being cautious." "Why take a chance on me then?" Clara asked. "You don't know me any better than those other women you approached." James was quiet for a moment, guiding the horses around a rough patch in the trail. "Honestly, because I saw something in your eyes back at that trading post, determination, pride despite Morrison trying to strip it away. You didn't beg or plead or act helpless. You were ready to take your supplies and keep moving forward, no matter how hard the path. That's the kind of person I want working with me, not for me. Someone who won't quit when things get difficult." Clara felt warmth spread through her chest. "You barely know me, and you already have more faith in me than most people who have known me for years." "Sometimes you just know," James said simply. "My father used to say you can tell everything about a person in the first 5 minutes if you pay attention to the right things. Not what they look like or how they talk, but how they carry themselves, how they treat others, how they handle adversity." They rode in silence for a while, and Clara found herself studying James from the corner of her eye. He had strong features, weathered by sun and wind, with lines around his mouth that suggested he laughed often. His hands on the reins were capable and sure. He couldn't have been much older than 30, still young but with the bearing of someone who had shouldered responsibility early. "How old are you, if you don't mind me asking?" Clara said. 29, James replied. "You, 24. And you never married?" The question wasn't unkind, just curious. Clara chose her words carefully. "There was someone before the fire. We had an understanding. After the fire, he visited me once in the hospital. Saw the burns, told me he was sorry but he couldn't marry someone who looked like that. Said his family would never accept it." "Then he was a fool and a coward," James said flatly. "You're better off without him." "That's what I tell myself," Clara said. "Most days I even believe it." The ranch appeared on the horizon as they crested a hill, and Clara's breath caught. The main house was larger than she expected, a solid 2-story structure built from timber and stone. A wide porch wrapped around the front, and she could see curtains in the windows, though they hung crooked and dusty. Behind the main house stood a bunkhouse, a barn, several corrals, and various outbuildings. The creek James mentioned ran along the eastern edge of the property, lined with cottonwood trees. Cattle dotted the distant hills, grazing peacefully. "It's beautiful," Clara said honestly. "It's home," James replied, and she heard the pride in his voice. "Needs work, always needs work, but it's mine. Ours now, I suppose, if you're staying." He pulled the wagon up to the front of the house, and immediately 3 men emerged from the barn. They approached with curiosity, clearly wondering about the woman on the wagon seat. "Boys," James called out. "Come meet Miss Clara Bennett. She's agreed to be our new housekeeper, so I expect you all to be on your best behavior." The oldest of the 3, a grizzled man with a gray beard and kind eyes, stepped forward first. "Charlie Hoskins, ma'am, pleased to make your acquaintance." "Please excuse the state of things. We've been living like heathens without a woman's touch around here." 2 younger men with dark hair and similar features pushed forward. "Miguel Reyes," said the taller one, "and this is my brother Carlos. Welcome to Dalton Ranch, Miss Bennett. Where's Tommy?" James asked, climbing down from the wagon. "Out checking the north fence line," Charlie replied. "Should be back before supper." James moved around to help Clara down, and she was grateful for the support as her legs had stiffened during the ride. As her feet touched the ground, she became aware of the men studying her, their gazes catching on her visible scars. She braced herself for comments, but none came. They simply waited, respectful and patient. "Let me show you the house," James said, picking up her satchel and one of the packages. "Boys, unload the rest of the supplies and put them in the kitchen." "Yes, boss," they chorused. Immediately moving to comply, James led Clara up the porch steps and through the front door. The interior of the house was indeed a disaster, though she could see the good bones beneath the chaos. The main room served as both living area and dining space, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall. Furniture sat covered in dust, papers and discarded clothing littered every surface, and the floor hadn't been swept in what looked like weeks. "I know it's bad," James said, sounding almost embarrassed. "We tried to keep up with it, but between running the ranch and regular work, something had to give." "It's nothing that can't be fixed with time and effort," Clara said, already mentally cataloging what needed to be done. "Show me the kitchen." The kitchen was attached to the main room, a good-sized space with a cast-iron stove, a large sink with a pump handle, and plenty of counter space. Dirty dishes were piled everywhere, and Clara spotted something growing mold in a pot on the stove. "This will be my first priority," she said firmly. "No one can live properly without a clean kitchen and decent meals." James showed her the rest of the downstairs, which included a small office and a water closet, before leading her upstairs. There were 4 bedrooms on the second floor. James's room was at the front of the house, large and surprisingly neat compared to the chaos downstairs. The other 3 rooms were smaller. One was clearly used for storage, another stood completely empty. "This would be your room," James said, opening the door to the 3rd bedroom. It was a good size, with a window overlooking the creek, a bed with a bare mattress, a dresser, and a small desk. "I'll have the boys bring up some fresh linens. There should be blankets in the storage room." Clara set down her satchel and walked to the window. The view was spectacular, all rolling hills and open sky. "It's perfect," she said softly. "I'll let you get settled," James said. "Come down when you're ready. No pressure to start work today. Tomorrow is soon enough." But Clara shook her head. "If it's all the same to you, I'd like to start now. That kitchen won't clean itself, and those men need a proper meal." James smiled, that warm expression that crinkled his eyes. "All right then, I'll be in the barn if you need anything. Charlie can show you where we keep the cleaning supplies, what there are of them." After James left, Clara took a few moments to unpack her meager belongings. She had 3 dresses, all well-worn but clean and mended. A few undergarments, a nightgown, her mother's brush, and her father's pocket watch stopped at the moment the fire broke out. She set the watch on the dresser, a reminder of what she had survived and what she still carried with her. Then she rolled up her sleeves, tied back her dark hair with a ribbon, and headed downstairs. Charlie was waiting in the kitchen, looking sheepish. "Mrs. Henderson would be horrified," he said, surveying the mess. "I'm right sorry about the state of things, Miss Bennett. Call me Clara," she said, "and don't apologize, just show me where things are and I'll get started." For the next several hours, Clara worked with a determination born of purpose. She heated water on the stove, washed every dish, scrubbed every counter. Charlie and Miguel brought in wood for the stove and fresh water from the pump outside. She found the dry goods storage and took inventory, making a mental list of what would need to be ordered. By the time the sun began to set, the kitchen gleamed. Clara had found enough ingredients to make a hearty stew with the beef Miguel brought from the cold cellar, along with biscuits and strong coffee. The smell drew the men like moths to a flame. Tommy arrived just as Clara was setting the table, a lanky young man with red hair and freckles. His eyes widened when he saw her, clearly not expecting a woman, but James shot him a warning look and he quickly composed himself. "Miss Bennett, this is Tommy Fletcher," James said. "Tommy, mind your manners." "Pleased to meet you, ma'am," Tommy said, snatching his hat off his head. They all sat down to dinner together, the men around the long wooden table and Clara serving from the kitchen. She had intended to eat separately, but James wouldn't hear of it. "You work here, you eat with us," he said firmly. "No standing on ceremony at Dalton Ranch." The men ate with the enthusiasm of people who had been living on poor food for too long. Compliments flew, and Clara felt a flush of pride. Cooking had always been something she enjoyed, a way to show care for others. "This is the best meal I've had in months," Carlos said around a mouthful of biscuit. "You are a miracle worker, Miss Clara." "Just doing my job," Clara replied, but she couldn't help smiling. After dinner, the men offered to help clean up, but Clara shooed them away. "You all have early mornings, I'm sure. I can manage the dishes." James lingered after the others had filed out. "You did good today," he said. Better than good, you've already made this place feel more like a home. Thank you for giving me the chance, Clara said, meeting his eyes. You took a risk on me. Best risk I've taken in a long time, James replied. He hesitated, then added, I hope you'll be happy here, Clara. I know it's isolated and the work is hard, but we're good people. We'll treat you right. I believe you, Clara said, and she meant it. That night, lying in her new bed with clean sheets and the sound of the creek outside her window, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in 2 years. Hope. The future stretched before her, not as a series of closed doors and cruel rejections, but as possibility. She touched the scars on her arm, familiar and permanent, but for the first time they didn't feel like marks of shame. They were simply part of her story, and maybe that story wasn't over yet. The next weeks fell into a comfortable rhythm. Clara woke before dawn to start breakfast, feeding the men before they headed out for the day's work. She spent her mornings cleaning, working her way through the neglected house room by room. Afternoons were for baking, mending, and managing supplies. Evenings meant preparing dinner and, increasingly, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee as the sun set. James often joined her during those quiet evening moments. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes, their observations about the world. Clara learned that James had wanted to be a teacher when he was young, but duty to his family's ranch had called him home. James learned that Clara had once dreamed of opening her own dress shop, creating beautiful things for special occasions. Why can't you still do that? James asked one evening, about 3 weeks after Clara's arrival. Who would buy dresses from someone who looks like me? Clara replied, the old bitterness creeping into her voice. Someone who has sense enough to recognize quality work, James said. Your sewing is exceptional, Clara. I've seen how you've mended our clothes, how you've made new curtains for the house. You have real talent. Clara looked down at her hands, the scarred left and the unmarked right. Maybe someday. Life's too short for someday, James said gently. My father died at 47. Heart just gave out one day while he was working. He had so many plans, so many somedays that never came. Don't wait for the perfect moment, Clara. It might never arrive. His words stayed with her, planting seeds she didn't quite know how to nurture yet, but she felt them taking root. The men grew comfortable with her presence, joking and laughing at meals, consulting her about everything from how to treat a wound to whether a particular shirt was beyond saving. She became the heart of the household, the presence that transformed a building into a home. But it was James who occupied her thoughts more than she cared to admit. She found herself watching for him during the day, feeling a flutter in her chest when he came in from the fields. She noticed small things about him. The way he always hung up his hat in the same spot, how he hummed tunelessly when he was content, the careful way he handled the ranch's newborn calves. And she saw the way he looked at her. Not with pity or revulsion, but with growing warmth and admiration. He complimented her cooking, her efficiency, the way she had transformed the house. But more than that, he sought her company, her conversation, her opinion on matters both trivial and important. One evening in late August, nearly 6 weeks after Clara's arrival, a violent storm rolled across the plains. Thunder shook the house and lightning split the sky. Clara stood at the kitchen window, watching nature's fury when James came up behind her. Reminds you of the fire? He asked quietly. Clara nodded, her throat tight. The lightning, that's what started it, struck our house during a storm just like this. My father went back inside to get my mother's jewelry box. The stairs collapsed. I tried to reach him, that's when the burning beam fell on my arm. She touched her scars unconsciously. I can still hear them screaming sometimes. James moved closer, close enough that she could feel his warmth. I'm sorry you went through that. No one should have to carry that kind of loss. Do you think the scars will ever stop mattering? Clara asked, voicing the question that haunted her. Will I ever just be Clara again, not Clara with the burns? James was quiet for a moment. Then he reached out, slowly enough that she could pull away if she wanted, and gently took her scarred hand in his. I see Clara when I look at you. Just Clara. Beautiful, capable, kind Clara who makes the best biscuits in Wyoming Territory and who laughs at my terrible jokes and who brought light back into this house. Clara's breath caught. James? I know it's probably too soon, he continued, his voice rough with emotion. I know you might not feel the same way, but I need you to know that you're not damaged goods, Clara Bennett. You're the strongest, most remarkable woman I've ever met, and every day I wake up grateful that fate brought you to that trading post on the exact day I was there. Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks. I feel the same, she whispered. I've been so afraid to hope, so afraid that I was reading too much into kindness. But James, you've made me feel whole again. You've made me feel seen. He cupped her face in his hands, thumbs gently wiping away her tears. May I kiss you? Yes, Clara breathed. The kiss was soft and sweet, full of promise and possibility. When they pulled apart, Clara was smiling through her tears, and James was looking at her like she hung the moon. I want to court you properly, James said. I want to do this right. We live in the same house, Clara pointed out, laughing a little. How exactly does courting work in this situation? We'll figure it out, James said, grinning. I'll bring you flowers from the creek. We'll take walks together. I'll be insufferably romantic, and you'll have to pretend to be surprised even though you're living under the same roof. I think I can manage that, Clara said, happiness bubbling up inside her like a spring. The next morning, the men noticed immediately that something had shifted. James and Clara kept stealing glances at each other across the breakfast table, and when James left for work, he squeezed Clara's shoulder in passing, a gesture of affection that made her blush. Charlie cornered her in the kitchen while she was washing dishes. He's a good man, our boss, the old cowboy said. Best I've ever worked for. Fair, honest, treats people right. You could do a lot worse. I know, Clara said softly. I think I could search the whole world over and not do any better. He's been lonely, Charlie continued. Since his father passed and his mother left. Oh, he's had us and we're good company in our way, but it's not the same as having someone who's yours, who you're building a life with. You've made him happy again. We all see it. The courtship that followed was unlike anything Clara had imagined. James did indeed bring her flowers, wildflowers from the creek and the hills, presenting them with exaggerated formality that made her laugh. They took evening walks together, exploring the ranch property, talking about everything under the vast Wyoming sky. James taught her to ride, patiently leading her horse until she grew confident enough to ride alone. In September, James took Clara into Cheyenne for the county fair. She hesitated, worried about facing Morrison and others who had judged her, but James was insistent. You have nothing to hide and nothing to be ashamed of, he said firmly. And I want to show off the woman who's stolen my heart. At the fair, they walked hand in hand through the crowd. Clara saw Morrison at one point, his expression souring when he spotted them together. But James simply nodded coolly in his direction and kept walking. They looked at livestock, ate candy apples, and watched the horse races. James won Clara a ribbon in the shooting competition, presenting it to her with a bow that made her giggle. But the best moment came when they were looking at the quilts in the women's exhibition hall. Clara stopped in front of a particular beautiful pattern, studying the intricate stitching. You could make something like that, James said. Better even. Maybe I will, Clara replied, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. Maybe I'll enter something next year. That's my girl, James said, pride evident in his voice. On the wagon ride home, Clara leaned against James's shoulder, content and tired. Thank you, she said. For what? For today. For making me feel normal, for not treating me like I'm fragile or broken. You're the least broken person I know, James said, pressing a kiss to her hair. You're just healing, same as everyone else in this world. We've all got scars, Clara. Yours just happen to be visible. As autumn painted the landscape in gold and crimson, James and Clara's relationship deepened. They stole kisses in the barn, held hands under the dinner table when they thought the men weren't looking, and spent long evenings on the porch wrapped in blankets against the cooling air, talking and dreaming together. In late October, James asked Clara to take a ride with him to a part of the ranch she hadn't seen yet. They rode for about an hour, climbing into the foothills until they reached a spot that overlooked the entire valley. The view was breathtaking, with the ranch spread below them and the mountains rising behind. "My father brought me here when I was 15, James said, dismounting and helping Clara down. "Told me that someday all of this would be mine and that I'd need to care for it and the people who depended on it. He said a man's worth isn't measured by what he has, but by what he gives and who he loves." Clara's heart was pounding. She had a feeling she knew where this was going. James took both her hands in his, looking down at her with those blue eyes that had seen her from the very beginning. "I love you, Clara Bennett. I loved you from the moment you stood up to Morrison's cruelty with your head held high. I love your strength, your kindness, your laugh, the way you hum when you're baking. I love that you've turned my house into a home and my life into something worth living fully." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, pulling out a simple gold band. "This was my grandmother's ring. My father gave it to my mother when he proposed, and she left it for me when she went to Oregon. I want you to have it. I want you to be my wife, to build this life with me, to face whatever comes knowing we face it together." Tears streamed down Clara's face, but they were tears of joy. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, James, I'll marry you. I love you so much." He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her deeply, thoroughly, a kiss that sealed their promise to each other. When they returned to the ranch, they announced their engagement to the men, who whooped and hollered their congratulations. Charlie had tears in his eyes, and Miguel and Carlos took turns clapping James on the back. Tommy just grinned like a fool, clearly delighted. "When's the wedding?" Charlie asked. James looked at Clara. "What do you think, spring?" Clara shook her head. "Why wait? I don't need a big ceremony or elaborate preparations. I just need you and a preacher." "There's a circuit preacher due through Cheyenne in 2 weeks, James said. "We could be married then if you're sure." "I've never been more sure of anything," Clara replied. The next 2 weeks were a flurry of preparation. Clara sewed herself a new dress, a simple but elegant design in deep blue that brought out her eyes. The men cleaned up the ranch until it gleamed, and Charlie began building furniture for what would become Clara and James's shared bedroom. They decided to convert the largest upstairs bedroom, adding a sitting area and expanding the wardrobe. The night before the wedding, Clara sat on the porch with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, looking at the stars. James found her there, sitting down beside her, having second thoughts. He asked, though his tone was light. "Not even for a moment," Clara said. "I was just thinking about how much my life has changed since that day at the trading post. I felt so hopeless then, so certain that I would always be alone, always be the damaged woman no one wanted. And now I'm the luckiest woman in Wyoming Territory," Clara said, smiling at him. "I found a man who sees me, really sees me, and loves me anyway, or maybe because of everything I am, scars and all. Especially because of everything you are," James corrected, taking her hand. "Tomorrow I get to call you my wife. I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt your worth again." They married on a crisp November morning in a small church in Cheyenne. Charlie, Miguel, Carlos, and Tommy all attended, dressed in their Sunday best. Mrs. Anderson from the general store came, having befriended Clara on their supply runs into town. A handful of other townspeople who had gotten to know Clara through James attended as well. Clara wore her blue dress and carried a bouquet of late-season wildflowers. She had decided not to hide her scars, wearing her hair pinned up and her sleeves at a normal length. As she walked down the aisle toward James, she saw only love in his eyes, only joy and pride. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. When James said his vows, promising to love and cherish her all the days of his life, his voice was steady and sure. When Clara promised the same, she felt the truth of it in her bones. They were choosing each other, building something together that would last. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, James kissed her gently, sweetly, mindful of their audience but unable to hide his happiness. As they turned to face their friends, Clara saw Morrison standing at the back of the church. He had clearly come to witness what he probably thought would be a disaster. But when he saw the happiness radiating from both bride and groom, the love and support from everyone present, his expression shifted to something like shame. He slipped out before the ceremony ended. The celebration afterward was boisterous and joyful. Mrs. Anderson had made a cake, and the men had pooled their money to buy Clara and James a set of fine china. They ate and drank and danced in the church hall, and Clara felt more loved and accepted than she ever had in her life. As the sun began to set, James and Clara said their goodbyes and headed back to the ranch in the wagon. The men had agreed to stay in town for the night, giving the newlyweds privacy. The ranch house was quiet and peaceful when they arrived. James carried Clara over the threshold, making her laugh, then set her down gently in the main room. A fire crackled in the fireplace, laid by one of the men before they left. "Welcome home, Mrs. Dalton," James said softly. "It's been home for months," Clara replied. "But now it's perfect." That night, in the privacy of their bedroom, James loved Clara with tenderness and passion, showing her with touch and whispered words how precious she was to him. He kissed her scars, every single one, telling her they were beautiful because they were part of her. And Clara, who had spent so long feeling broken and unwanted, finally understood what it meant to be cherished completely. Winter arrived with snow and cold winds, but the ranch house was warm and full of life. Clara and James settled into married life with an ease that suggested they had been together for years. They worked side by side, managing the ranch and planning for the future. James taught Clara the business side of ranching, showing her the books and asking her opinion on decisions. Clara continued to manage the household, but now with a sense of ownership and partnership that made every task meaningful. In January, Clara discovered she was pregnant. She told James one evening after dinner, nervously twisting her hands together, "Are you happy about it?" She asked, needing to hear his reaction. James's face split into the biggest smile she had ever seen. He swept her up in his arms, spinning her around despite her laughing protests. "Happy, Clara, I'm beyond happy. We're going to have a family, a real family." "I'm a little scared," she admitted. "I don't know anything about being a mother." "You'll be wonderful," James said with complete confidence. "You have so much love to give, and our child will be lucky to have you." The men were equally thrilled when they heard the news. Charlie immediately began whittling baby toys, and Miguel and Carlos started building a cradle, arguing cheerfully about the best design. Tommy blushed red whenever anyone mentioned the coming baby, clearly embarrassed by the whole situation but also excited. Spring brought new life to the ranch. Calves were born, flowers bloomed along the creek, and Clara's belly grew round with their child. She sewed baby clothes in the evenings, tiny gowns and blankets that seemed impossibly small. James read books about childbirth and infant care, determined to be prepared. In late summer, with the help of a midwife brought from town, Clara gave birth to a son. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Clara feared she wouldn't survive. But James never left her side, holding her hand, encouraging her, refusing to let her give up. When the baby's first cry filled the room, Clara collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted but elated. James cut the cord with shaking hands, and the midwife cleaned the baby before placing him in Clara's arms. "He's perfect," Clara whispered, staring down at the tiny face, the miniature fingers that wrapped around her thumb. "He looks like you," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "He has your eyes." They named him Samuel after James's father. Samuel James Dalton, born August 15, 1879, weighing 7 pounds and making more noise than seemed possible for such a small creature. The men came to visit the next day, each taking a turn holding the baby with exaggerated care, as if Samuel might break if they breathed wrong. Charlie declared that the boy had the look of a natural horseman. Miguel said he had his father's strong jaw. Carlos insisted he had his mother's gentle spirit. Tommy just stared in wonder, clearly having never been this close to a newborn before. The first months of parenthood were exhausting and exhilarating. Samuel had a powerful set of lungs and used them frequently, especially at night. Clara walked the floor with him for hours, singing lullabies her mother had once sung to her. James took turns when he could, developing a knack for bouncing the baby in a particular rhythm that usually brought sleep. But despite the exhaustion, Clara had never been happier. She would stand at the window with Samuel in her arms, showing him the ranch that would one day be his, telling him stories about his father and grandfather, about the home they had built together. One afternoon when Samuel was about 4 months old, Clara found James in the barn repairing a saddle. The baby was napping and she had a rare moment of free time. "Remember when you asked me why I couldn't still make dresses?" she said. James looked up from his work. "I remember. I've been thinking about it. Once Samuel is a bit older and sleeping better, I'd like to start taking on sewing projects. Nothing huge, just occasional work." Mrs. Anderson mentioned that women in town are always looking for someone who can do alterations and special occasion dresses. "I think that's a wonderful idea," James said, setting down the saddle. "You should use your talents, Clara. You're too skilled to keep it just to our family. You don't think it would be too much with the baby and the house? I think you can do anything you set your mind to," James said firmly. "And I'll help however I can. We're partners in this life, remember?" So Clara began to sew again, taking on small projects at first. A hem here, a mended tear there. But word spread about her skill, and soon she was creating dresses for dances and special occasions. She worked in the evenings after Samuel was asleep, her needle flying as she brought beautiful things to life. One day in spring, nearly 2 years after she had first arrived at the trading post, a woman came to the ranch asking for Clara. She was well-dressed, clearly from a wealthy family in Cheyenne. "My daughter is getting married," the woman said. "I've seen your work, Mrs. Dalton. The dress you made for Susan Anderson's daughter was exquisite. I'd like you to make my daughter's wedding dress. Money is no object." Clara felt a flutter of pride and anxiety. A wedding dress was a serious undertaking. "I'd be honored," she said. "When is the wedding?" 3 months from now," the woman replied. They discussed designs and took measurements when the daughter arrived the following week. Clara threw herself into the project, determined to create something truly special. She worked late into the evenings, and James often came upstairs to find her bent over her sewing, lost in concentration. The dress was a masterpiece, with delicate lace and beading that caught the light. When she delivered it, the bride burst into tears of joy, and her mother paid Clara twice what they had agreed upon. "You have a real gift," the mother said. "You should open a shop in town." The words stayed with Clara. Could she really do that? Open her own business? She discussed it with James that night. "I think you should," he said without hesitation. "You've proven you can do the work. People are seeking you out. Why not make it official?" "But what about the ranch, the house?" "Samuel will figure it out," James said. "Maybe you work a few days a week in town, and I hire someone to help with the house on those days. Or maybe you set up a shop here and people come to you. There are options, Clara. Don't let fear hold you back from something you want." After much consideration and planning, Clara opened a small dressmaking business in Cheyenne. She rented a modest space on Main Street and hired a young woman named Sarah to help with basic sewing tasks. She worked in town 3 days a week, and James cared for Samuel on those days with help from the ranch hands, who had become quite adept at entertaining a toddler. The business thrived. Clara's reputation grew, and women came from surrounding counties to commission her work. She never hid her scars, and if anyone commented, she simply smiled and went back to her work. Her skill spoke for itself. 3 years after Samuel's birth, Clara gave birth to a daughter they named Rose. And 2 years after that, another son they called William. The house that had once been too quiet and too empty was now full of noise and laughter and chaos. The ranch prospered as well. James expanded the herd and bought adjacent land from a retiring rancher. Charlie stayed on until he was too old to work, then lived in the bunkhouse as an honored member of the family. Miguel and Carlos eventually saved enough to buy their own small ranch nearby, though they still came by frequently to visit. Tommy married a girl from town and became James's foreman, proving himself a capable and trustworthy manager. On their 10th wedding anniversary, James and Clara rode out to the spot where he had proposed, leaving the children with a trusted neighbor. They sat together on a blanket, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Do you ever think about that day at the trading post?" James asked, his arm around Clara's shoulders. "Sometimes," Clara admitted. "I think about how lost I felt, how certain I was that my life was over. And then I think about how you looked at me, really looked at me, and saw something worth believing in." "I saw the truth," James said. "Morrison called you damaged goods, but all I saw was a woman who had survived hell and came out stronger. You were perfect for my home then, and you're perfect for my heart now." Clara leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart. "You saved me that day." "No," James said gently. "You saved yourself by having the courage to accept a chance when it was offered. You saved yourself by choosing to trust again, to hope again, to love again. I just had the privilege of being there when you did." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their ranch spread below them, knowing their children were safe and happy, that their life together was everything they had dreamed and more. "Thank you," Clara said finally. "For what?" "For seeing me when no one else would. For loving me when I couldn't love myself, for building this beautiful life with me." James kissed her forehead, her scarred cheek, her lips. "Loving you has been the easiest thing I've ever done. You're the best decision I ever made, Clara Dalton." As they rode back to the ranch in the twilight, Clara thought about the girl she had been, scared and scarred and certain she would always be alone. And she thought about the woman she had become, strong and loved and surrounded by family. The scars were still there, visible reminders of pain survived. But they were no longer the most important thing about her. They were just part of her story, the story of a woman who had been through fire and emerged not destroyed, but refined. Years continued to pass in the gentle rhythm of ranch life. Samuel grew tall and serious, learning the business of ranching from his father and developing a reputation for fair dealing that echoed James's own character. Rose inherited her mother's skill with a needle and her father's business sense, eventually taking over Clara's dressmaking shop and expanding it into a successful establishment. William, the youngest, had a gift with horses that reminded everyone of his grandfather, training animals with patience and intuition. Clara's sewing business became legendary throughout Wyoming Territory and beyond. She employed 6 seamstresses and took commissions from wealthy families as far away as Denver. But she never forgot where she had come from, often taking on pro bono work for women in difficult circumstances, understanding what it meant to need a fresh start. James remained her anchor and her partner. They still took evening walks together when weather permitted, still sat on the porch sharing coffee and conversation, still looked at each other with the same love and admiration that had bloomed that day in Morrison's trading post. Morrison himself eventually closed his store, unable to compete with merchants who treated all customers with dignity. Clara heard he moved back east, though she gave him little thought. He was part of her past, a reminder of how far she had come, but not someone she wasted energy on. When Clara turned 50, James threw her a party at the ranch. Over 100 people attended, including customers who had become friends, fellow business owners from Cheyenne, ranch families from across the county. As Clara looked around at the celebration, at her grown children and her grandchildren playing in the yard, at her husband who still looked at her like she was the most beautiful woman in the world, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. That evening, after the guests had left and the house was quiet, James found Clara in her sewing room, looking at a photograph from their wedding day. She had been so young then, so uncertain despite her happiness. What are you thinking about?" James asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "About the journey," Clara said, leaning back against him. "About how every painful step led me exactly where I needed to be. No regrets." "Not a single one," Clara said firmly. "Well, maybe that I didn't accept your offer fast enough that day at the trading post. I should have said yes before we even got to the wagon." James laughed, the sound warm and familiar. "You said yes at exactly the right moment. Everything happened exactly as it was supposed to." They stood together in the fading light, two people who had found each other against the odds and built something lasting. The scars that had once seemed like Clara's defining feature were now simply part of the tapestry of her life, no more or less significant than her smile, her talent, her resilience. As they prepared for bed that night, Clara caught her reflection in the mirror. The scars were still there, faded with time but permanent. She touched them gently, remembering the fire, the pain, the loss, but also remembering the cowboy who had seen past them to the woman beneath. The cowboy who had said she was perfect for his home and then spent decades proving it every single day. "I love you," she told James as they settled into bed. "I love you too," he replied, pulling her close. "My perfect Clara." And in the warm darkness of their bedroom, in the home they had built together, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived and love well given, Clara finally and completely understood what she had always been worth. Not damaged goods, not scarred or broken or less than. Simply human, beautifully imperfect and deeply loved. The ranch continued to thrive under Samuel's eventual management, with Rose and William contributing their own skills and passion. Clara and James grew old together, their hair turning silver, their movements slower but their love undiminished. They became the wise elders of the community, sought out for advice and celebrated for their enduring partnership. On their 50th wedding anniversary, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren, Clara and James renewed their vows in the same church where they had first married. Clara wore blue again, though her dress was designed by Rose this time. James still looked at her the same way he had 5 decades earlier, with wonder and devotion. "50 years ago, I found the other half of my soul," James said during the ceremony, his voice still strong despite his age. "Clara, you have been my partner, my love, my home. Every day with you has been a gift, and I would do it all again in a heartbeat." Clara squeezed his hands, her own eyes bright with tears. "You taught me that scars don't define us, that past pain doesn't determine future joy, that love sees the whole person, not just the visible wounds. You gave me a life beyond my wildest dreams, and I am grateful for every single moment." As they kissed, their family cheered, and the sound echoed through the church and out into the Wyoming sunshine. Later, at the celebration on the ranch, Charlie's son gave a toast, honoring the couple who had shown 3 generations what true partnership looked like. That night, Clara and James sat on their porch as they had done thousands of times before, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The ranch was quiet, their guests having finally departed, their family settled in various bedrooms throughout the expanded house. "You remember what you said to me that very first night?" Clara asked. "After dinner." "I said a lot of things," James replied with a smile. "I was trying to convince you to stay." "You said you hoped I'd be happy here," Clara said. "You said you were good people and would treat me right." "And did we?" "You gave me everything," Clara said simply. "A home, a family, a purpose, and love beyond measure. You gave me myself back when I thought I'd lost her forever in that fire." James brought her hand to his lips, kissing her scarred palm. "You were never lost, my love, just waiting to be found." They sat in peaceful silence, 2 souls who had found each other against impossible odds, who had built a legacy of love and strength, who had proven that the most beautiful stories often begin with the words, "She's perfect for my home." And Clara, looking at the life spread before her like the endless Wyoming sky, knew with absolute certainty that she had been perfect all along. It just took the right person to see it, The end of their story came peacefully, many years later, when both were in their late 80s. James passed first in his sleep with Clara holding his hand. He left her with a house full of memories, a family that bore his values, and a love story that would be told for generations. Clara followed him 2 years later, having spent her remaining time finishing a special project, a memory quilt that depicted the story of their life together. Each square showed a significant moment: the trading post where they met, the ranch house, their wedding, each of their children's births, the dressmaking shop, the land they loved. She finished the final stitch just days before peacefully slipping away, surrounded by her children. The quilt became a treasured family heirloom, passed down through generations, a reminder that love sees beyond surface scars to the beautiful soul within. And in the annals of Wyoming history, in the stories told around dinner tables and campfires, the tale of Clara and James Dalton endured as proof that sometimes the most profound love stories begin with someone brave enough to look past what others call damaged and see instead something perfect, waiting to be cherished.